Welcome to the Ponderings podcast. This is your host, Milo, and in this episode, I'm going to be talking about prehensions, Whitehead's prehensions, and comparing it to quantum decoherence. This is the second episode of the SpookyCast series, which is going to be done for the month of October. Spooky because I'll be talking about quantum theory. I'm learning it as I'm presenting it to you, so I'm trying to make sense of it as well, especially how it relates to Whitehead. Whitehead is pretty complicated as well, but honestly, it's pretty fun to challenge myself to try and understand this and then to try and explain it. I'm going to begin by talking about Whitehead's theory of prehensions, go over some of his concepts, and then I'll go into quantum decoherence and then sort of tie the two together. So what is a prehension? A prehension is it's sort of taking the data that's out there and incorporating it into your being. So for Whitehead, there isn't a soul, there isn't like a being, but it's basically we're made up of events and we have a historical root, as in we're made up of past events and we're constantly being created. Or we're constantly becoming, we're constantly creating ourselves, we're constantly in a process rather than being like a soul or a static unity. We're always becoming something through all these processes. So for Whitehead, he would characterize prehension as feeling, and it's not how we usually see feeling as an emotion or something, but he'd see it more as it affects a sort of transition. So it's a sort of taking in of data. So feeling would be the process of the, actual entity appropriating, so taking in the data to make it its own. Whitehead saw life as sort of robbery. He said that all life is robbery. We're always consuming something in order to give us life for energy, or even in cells, the way they interact with their environment, they're taking something from the environment, but they're also giving back something. So all life is sort of this process of robbery, taking things from the past, incorporating it into our present, and taking things from the present and kind of moving it towards what the future would be. So feelings affect a transition into subjectivity because they create a sort of subjective unity when the same sort of process is repeated. So a feeling is a positive prehension, and positive prehension is something that you take in. So for decoherence, I'm going to be talking about negative prehensions, which is the mode in which things are not felt. They're eliminated from feeling. That's still a kind of relationship, even though it's something that is not taking in. The relationship is of avoidance or of elimination. And decoherence is sort of having to do with that, eliminating possibilities or eliminating interferences that wouldn't be coherent. So an entity either feels, positively prehends whatever is encountered, or the entity actively rejects whatever is encountered from feeling. An entity also feels, it picks up from whatever is in the immediate past, which includes its own state of being, eternal objects. This is what makes up historical root, because it's picking up its own state of being. Not that there's a soul that it's sort of taking along with it, enduring. It's just that it repeats itself. But it doesn't repeat itself exactly the same. It's always a novel production. The concrescence is always a production of novel togetherness. So it's always taking in the data that already exists and then creating new data out of those new configurations. And it also is the actual entity is also only able to encounter other entities that are relevant. Everything within the direct vicinity of the entity. So a feeling for Whitehead is different for plants and animals and humans. There's different complexities of feeling. For Whitehead, it's used technically rather than its usual anthropomorphic associations with emotions. So, for example, Tree and plants release pheromones when the insects, start eating their leaves. These pheromones warn the rest of the trees or the other parts of the tree, its branches, of the potential predators. This is a feeling in action, I guess. Like, it's taking in the information from the environment or from other entities, and then it's communicating to itself and also to the environment as like a warning to itself, but then also as like a warning to the environment as like this isn't a wanted relationship. So it's always sort of like communication. It's always about relationships, from all the way from the quantum realm to like plants, animals, humans. We're always communicating with the environment and with other actual entities. So again, repetition. These actual entities repeat themselves in that they do not represent other entities or their sensations as mental images. The earlier entity is actually present in the later entity. Again, yeah, so it is a repetition, but it's not exactly the same. It's taking from the past, it's taking from the data that's around and creating a new concrescence, a novel process of becoming. Causality and perception for Whitehead are the same thing. Whitehead understands causality as the tendency for the present to conform to the immediate past. And that would be considered the basic condition for becoming. The present has a tendency, it repeats this tendency to conform to the immediate past. And that would be sort of like the grounding of this present. It needs to take in the immediate past as well as the relevant entities around it. And for concrescence, the novelty is introduced to the prehension of a previous entity. So it's not a mere conformity or repetition, but it's a production of novel togetherness between the actual entity at present and that which it prehends. So the eternal objects, immediate past. Most experience is non-conscious. We feel more than we can know. We are constantly, in each moment, prehending data from our immediate past, from other actual entities. So to compare that with quantum decoherence, decoherence is the method of negative selection by which quantum superpositions are eliminated. And every quantum mechanical measurement takes place in a closed system, and for us, that closed system is the universe. The environment envelops a measured system, so the universe. Nothing can be abstracted or measured outside of this system. So for Whitehead, he sort of incorporated this from physics, and that's why for his conception of God, it's not abstract. God participates with the universe. All these processes take place in the universe. You can't separate them from each other. You can't isolate one from another. You have to always take it into the context of all these things. You have to consider the context. So decoherence results from a negative selection process that dynamically eliminates non-classical states. So what this means, classical states would be ones that make sense, as in like there's not two particles in the same position at once. What decoherence does is make sure to eliminate anything that does not make sense in a system. And I'll get into this more when I explain what superposition is. But yeah, again, the universe is a closed system which guarantees the openness of every subsystem within it. The environment contains within itself an infinite amount of potential facts. This infinite amount of possibilities produces a great deal of cancellations or interfering. So interferences, these are the incompatible states within each of these subspaces. They would be considered the superpositions. So what decoherence does is sort of get rid of any interferences, because there's such a large amount of possibilities. This infinite amount of possibilities has the ability to cancel out itself, to only leave that which is coherent within the system. So what are superpositions? A superposition is a system that has two different states which define it. So it's possible for the system to exist in both. an electron has two possible quantum states. So it can spin up or spin down, but it's happening at the same time. And it only leaves the superposition state when it's measured. So again, it's like the particle versus wave physics. Measurement plays a part on how the particle sort of moves or reacts. One way of viewing a particle versus wave experiment, if you're looking at the speed of something and you have the exact speed, you can't figure out the exact location or position of it. And then if you're looking at the exact position, then you won't be able to determine the exact speed. So when you're measuring something, you're sort of only allowing that thing to have one mode of existence. So yeah, only when the datum is prehended by an actual entity does it drop out of potentiality to actuality. So there's always just an infinite amount of possibilities or potentialities, and the only moment when it drops out of potentiality to actuality is when that datum is being captured or seized or prehended by an actual entity, when it's taken into the actual entity, or when it's measured, when it's observed. Positive prehension is the datum that is appropriated or captured into the actual entity, into coherence. So, and then negative prehension is the datum that is not felt. It's the one that's negatively selected. Decoherence would be that negative prehension, the one that is not selected, not felt. So, from a superposition of states, a particle being in multiple positions at once, to being in only one position. This is what von Neumann termed the wave collapse. So basically, once a wave is measured, the one position becomes actual, such that the two positions of the wave function collapse into one or the other state. Again, observation plays a role on how things become, or measurement plays a role on how things become. How we prehend, what we prehend, plays a role on what exists, what's becoming. A wave collapse is a dynamically discontinuous process. So decoherence, again, it occurs because there's two potential states interfering with each other that are incapable of integration. So because they're incapable of integration, they kind of cancel each other out. The interrelation between the environmental datum and the datum comprised of our system, it continuously reduces any interfering superposition of states, so that the only alternative states left are mutually exclusive and exhaustive logical states, or probable states. So decoherence sort of cancels out anything that would not make sense with what's relevant for our system. And it only sort of leaves logical states or probabilities. So decoherence would favor history. History is an important thing when it comes to decoherence or the theory of prehensions. History is an ongoing process. The history of actual events evolves. It's characterized as a fluid potentiality made up of an ever-expanding lineage of discrete actualities, events, datum, drops of experience. Each novel actuality occurs as a result of antecedent actualities. So for something to become, it has to rely on its history. It has to have a history. It can't arise out of nothing. So here it sort of favors that idea that there isn't a creation ex nihilo, like there's no creation out of nothing. There's always been something in process. So each novel actuality has alternative potential histories of the universe, and all these histories are interrelated with all the antecedent facts that belong to the universe. So this interrelation allows for elimination of the vast majority of potentialities produced by the interrelation. There can't be like a plethora of alternative potential histories for the universe. There has to be one that is coherent with the present actual entity. If not, it would just kind of fall into chaos. There has to be some sort of coherent root that the actual entities are becoming in. Interfering superpositions of potential histories which are incompatible for integration are eliminated through the process of decoherence. That way there's a coherent historical root. So conditions, again, they must be consistent and relevant to be integrated into the actual entity or system. And the universe is the only closed system, and any closed system has a high amount or level of entropy. Entropy is chaos or disorder. Because we're open systems, everything in the universe is an open system. All the subsystems are open. And we self-organize, we self-regulate in order to create some sort of order and lessen the chaos, create some sort of coherence within all this chaos. And the coherence happens as a result of our tendency to repeat our antecedent actual entities as well as prehend data around us. We take that data in and we create a new, novel togetherness in the form of a new present actual entity, which serves as data for other actual entities and for ourselves. I don't know if that really cleared up anything, but basically prehensions are capture, they're robbery. Robbery not in the sense of something being morally bad, but just all life is we have to consume to live, to create, to become, to grow. We have to consume. This cells have to consume molecules and things like that in order to function correctly, in order to survive, to self-regulate. And decoherence, the part that it plays is in eliminating anything that is not relevant, anything that potentialities that are not relevant to a system. Decoherence would sort of eliminate that. Negative prehensions are us eliminating data that is not relevant. And we're not doing this actively, because prehension occurs at all moments, at all times. It's not something that we are conscious of or that we actively choose. It's just always happening. We're always self-regulating and self-organizing and becoming. We're always going from one moment to the next moment to the next moment. It isn't a process that we can even register that's happening. We can sort of think about it, but it's just something that's happening, all the way from the quantum to our cells and then to us just sort of navigating and self-regulating. It's cool because this gives us a sort of understanding that the subject, object, so subject would be us, or the person or the actual entity prehending, the object, the prehended data, right, and the environment are all interrelated, and they're ontologically incapable of being isolated from each other. So just from the get-go, you're refuting dualism or even monism. We have to think of things not as the oneness of things that we're interrelated. Yes, we're interrelated, we're interconnected, but there's different levels of complexity, there's diversity. We should see it as a multiplicity that is sort of self-organizing and self-regulating together. It doesn't cancel out to all be the same thing, the same one thing. We have to take into account diversity and how we can't erase all the differences. The differences are what make us increasingly more creative and more complex. And that's sort of the point of Whitehead's metaphysics, is sort of to point this out, that we're increasingly becoming more complex and this creativity is increasingly advancing. It's sort of like a forward movement and advancement and creative advancement. I hope this made some sense. It's definitely interesting to think about. There's a lot of nuance. Things aren't just simple. We have to take into account all that multiplicity, all that diversity in us and in the environment and in the universe. There's a lot of complexity, but from that complexity comes new creativity, new togetherness emerging in every moment. All right. Well, I hope this made a little bit of sense. I'm learning this sort of at the same time as you guys are. I kind of do a little bit of studying and then sort of try to use these like scientific theories or things that Whitehead was aware of to explain his philosophy a little better, make more sense of it. Yeah. Well, I hope that you continue to stay tuned. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.